At 36 years of age, Clara Penhaligon stood upon the sun-bleached boards of Oakhaven's main street with a spirit that had been hollowed out by the relentless machinery of the Blackwood Land and Cattle Company. It was the winter of 1887, and Julian Blackwood, a man who measured the worth of a soul by the acreage it occupied, had finally succeeded in casting her out of the valley ranch her father had spent 40 years carving from the sagebrush. She possessed nothing now but the tattered clothes on her back, a trunk of her father's rusted surveying tools, and a single, heavy silver dollar that felt like a leaden weight against her thigh. Desperate to find a roof that Blackwood could not legally tear from over her head, she stood before the local sheriff at a forced liquidation and paid that solitary dollar for the deed to the deserted Oakhaven General Store, a sagging, gray-timbered ruin that had not seen a customer since the creek went bone-dry 5 years prior. The townspeople watched from the shadows of their porches, their eyes clouded with a pity that tasted like ash, certain that Clara had traded her final hope for a pile of termite-ridden rot. Yet, beneath those warped floorboards and within the suffocating dust of the basement, there remained a secret sealed in a brass cylinder, a map not of buried bullion or hidden veins of ore, but a document of such profound truth that its revelation would not only restore Clara's life but would break the drought-strangled throat of the entire community. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Penhaligon. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten or overlooked by the world, we invite you to tell us your story in the comments below. To understand the woman who would buy a ruin for $1, one must first understand the man who raised her. Thomas Penhaligon had been a man of the transit and the chain, a surveyor who believed that the world could be understood through the precision of a lens and the steady hand of a cartographer. Clara had grown up in the shadow of his broad-brimmed hat, riding pillion on his chestnut mare as they traversed the jagged spine of the Nevada territories, learning the silent language of the horizon. While other girls were taught the intricacies of lace and the proper tempers for sourdough, Clara was taught how to read the dip of a strata and the subtle, emerald shift in the desert floor that whispered of hidden moisture. Her father often told her that a map was more than just lines on a page, it was a promise kept between the land and the people who walked upon it, a record of what was rightfully theirs. He was a man of quiet dignity who treated every boundary marker as a sacred oath, and Clara inherited his unwavering gaze and his capacity for long, rhythmic silences. They lived in a modest cabin near the mouth of the valley, a place where the air smelled of crushed juniper and a promise of rain that always seemed to linger just beyond the next ridge. Clara learned the value of a thing not by its price in a ledger, but by the utility of its design and the history of its use. She could repair a broken harness with a length of rawhide and a steady needle, and she could find her way home in a whiteout blizzard by the mere feel of the wind against her cheek. This was her education, a curriculum of resilience and observation that the world would soon attempt to dismantle. Her father's death had been a quiet affair, a sudden failing of the heart during the great drought of 1886, leaving Clara with a mountain of debt and a valley that was rapidly turning to dust. Julian Blackwood had appeared like a vulture before the body was even cold, waving papers that spoke of interest rates and collateral that her father, in his simple honesty, had never fully grasped. The fall was not a sudden drop, but a slow, agonizing erosion of everything Clara held dear. For months, she fought the Blackwood Company in the local courts, her voice a solitary reed against the gale of corporate lawyers and bought-and-paid-for judges. Julian Blackwood wanted the Penhaligon land not for the grass, which was yellowing into straw, but for the strategic position it held at the mouth of the canyon. He claimed the drought was an act of God, a divine mandate that justified his consolidation of every small holding in the territory. Clara watched as her neighbors, families she had known since childhood, packed their wagons with heavy hearts and headed east, leaving behind a landscape of empty windows and sagging fences. She stayed until the very end, until the day the sheriff arrived with a group of Blackwood's hired hands to pile her father's furniture in the dirt. They worked with a mechanical indifference that was more painful than malice, tossing her books and her linens into the heat as if they were nothing more than refuse. When she reached for her father's surveying trunk, a heavy oak box bound in brass, one of the men laughed and told her it was nothing but junk. Clara did not argue. She simply hauled the trunk onto a hand cart and began the long, dusty walk toward Oakhaven, the town that had once been the vibrant heart of the valley but was now a skeletal remains of its former self. Oakhaven was a place of ghosts, where the wind whistled through the gaps in the boardwalks like a funeral dirge. The only building left that wasn't claimed by Blackwood was the old general store, a structure that had been abandoned when the previous owner fled the debt collectors. It was a tomb of cedar and glass, its windows crusted with the grime of half a decade. When the sheriff announced the auction, his voice was thin and tired, echoing off the empty storefronts. No one bid. The town had no money, and the building had no future. But Clara, standing in the dust with her father's trunk and her last silver dollar, saw something the others did not. She saw a foundation that was still level, and she saw a chance to stand on ground that no one else wanted. She raised her hand, the silver dollar glinting like a tiny moon in her palm, and she bought herself a ruin. The purchase of the Oakhaven General Store was viewed by the remaining residents as an act of lunacy, a final, desperate gasp from a woman who had simply lost her mind along with her land. Clara moved in that very night, sleeping on a pile of empty grain sacks in the middle of the main floor, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and ancient spices. The first few days were spent in a blur of motion as she scrubbed the floors with sand and vinegar, clearing away the cobwebs that hung like gray tapestries from the ceiling. She found the basement on the fourth day, hidden beneath a heavy rug that had rotted into the floorboards. The trapdoor groaned as she heaved it open, revealing a steep, narrow staircase that led down into a darkness that felt cold and cavernous. Lighting a tallow candle, she descended into the belly of the building, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The basement was lined with heavy timber shelves, most of them empty, but in the farthest corner, tucked behind a stack of rusted lard tins, she found a long, cylindrical brass tube. It was heavy, sealed with a wax that had grown brittle with age, and it bore her father's distinctive, elegant mark, a stylized P encircled by a compass rose. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal and slid the contents out. It was a map, drawn on high-quality vellum that had resisted the dampness of the earth. As she unrolled it by the flickering light of her candle, she realized that this was not a standard land survey. It was a hydrological map of the entire valley, dated 3 years before her father's death, and it contained annotations in his tight, precise script that she had never seen before. The map showed the lost springs of Oakhaven, a network of subterranean aquifers that had been the town's original lifeblood before Julian Blackwood had built his dams and diverted the surface water for his cattle. But there was a more startling discovery, a series of red ink lines that traced the actual legal boundaries of the water rights, proving that the Blackwood Company had not only diverted the water but had done so by illegally encroaching on public land and falsifying the original territorial deeds. The deeper mystery of the map began to unfurl as Clara spent her nights studying the intricate details of her father's work. She realized that Thomas Penhaligon had discovered Blackwood's deception years ago and had been working in secret to document the truth, knowing that a direct confrontation would have led to his ruin or worse. The map was a masterwork of forensic cartography, showing exactly where the company had buried the original markers to hide their theft. More importantly, it showed a specific point on the outskirts of Oakhaven, just behind the general store, where the main aquifer sat a mere 12 feet beneath the surface, a source of pure, cold water that could never be dammed or diverted by any man above ground. This was the map worth more than gold, because in a desert, water is the only currency that truly matters. Clara felt a surge of purpose that she had not felt since the day she was evicted. She was no longer just a woman living in a ruin, she was the guardian of a truth that could topple a king. She began to venture out into the town, talking to the few families who remained, the bakers, the millers, and the old blacksmith, Elias, who had lost his forge when the coal stopped coming. She did not show them the map yet, she simply asked them if they remembered the old wells, and if they still had the strength to dig. She spoke with a quiet, infectious confidence that began to stir the embers of hope in their tired eyes. She started to trade her father's tools for labor, hiring Elias to sharpen shovels and the miller boys to help her clear the scrub from the backlot. Word of her activities eventually reached the ears of Julian Blackwood, who sat in his mahogany-paneled office 10 miles away, watching the horizon for any sign of rebellion. He sent his foreman, a man named Silas Thorne, to investigate the madwoman of Oakhaven. The climax arrived under the cover of a moonless night, a time when the desert air usually turned cold and silent. Clara had gathered the townspeople in the basement of the store, the map spread out on the central table. She showed them the red lines, the hidden markers, and the point on the map where the water waited. She told them that they were going to dig, not for gold or for glory, but for the right to exist. They worked in shifts, using hand tools and lanterns shielded by burlap sacks to keep the light from reaching the company guards on the ridge. Clara led the way, her father's transit used to mark the exact spot behind the store. The ground was hard, a crust of caliche that fought every strike of the pickaxe, but the men and women of Oakhaven dug with a fury born of 5 years of thirst. They dug through the night, their hands blistering and their backs aching, fueled by the memory of the green valley they had lost. At dawn, just as the sun began to bleed over the mountains, the ground beneath Elias's shovel turned dark and damp. A moment later, a bubbling sound rose from the hole, a soft, rhythmic pulsing that sounded like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Then, with a sudden, joyful surge, a geyser of crystal-clear water erupted from the sand, splashing against their faces and soaking their clothes. They wept as they drank, the taste of the earth and the sky combined in every drop. But their victory was not yet complete. Julian Blackwood, alerted by his guards, arrived in a black carriage, his face pale with rage. He stepped out into the mud of the new spring, his polished boots ruined, and began to scream about trespassing and property rights. Clara stepped forward, the map held firmly in her hand. She did not scream back. She simply handed him a legal injunction she had prepared with the help of the town's old retired schoolteacher, a document that cited the original survey and the fraudulent deeds. She told him that the water belonged to the people of Oakhaven, and that the state land commissioners were already on their way to verify the markers she had uncovered. Blackwood looked at the map, then at the water flowing freely into the thirsty soil, and then at the faces of the people who stood behind Clara. He saw that his empire of dust was over. The justice was quiet, there were no shots fired, no dramatic arrests. The company simply folded, its legal foundations revealed to be as hollow as its heart. Julian Blackwood left the valley a month later, a man broken not by violence, but by the undeniable weight of the truth. The theme of our story today is one of quiet resilience and the recognition of value in the places the world has discarded. Clara Penhaligon, a woman who was cast out with nothing but $1 and a name, found that the greatest treasures are often hidden in the ruins we are told to abandon. She did not seek to become a queen of the desert, she sought only to honor the promise her father had made to the land. Oakhaven began to bloom again, not as a corporate outpost, but as a community of small gardens and shared wells. The general store became a place of commerce once more, but its most popular item was never for sale. The map, framed in brass and hung behind the counter, served as a reminder that the lines we draw upon the earth are only as good as the truth they represent. Clara lived there for the rest of her days, a woman whose name became synonymous with the water that saved the valley. She proved that when a resourceful heart meets a forgotten truth, the desert itself can be made to sing. It is a story of how a single silver dollar, spent with wisdom and courage, can buy a future that gold could never secure. We see in Clara the spirit of the frontier, not the one of conquest and greed, but the one of endurance and the steady, quiet work of restoration. Thank you for spending this time with us in the old valley of Oakhaven. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share it with someone who might need a reminder of their own resilience. Before you go, we'd like to ask you, what is a time you found value in something others had written off as worthless? We look forward to reading your reflections in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.